Good afternoon. My name is Don Tonti-Ploffel, and I'm the Associate Director of Academic Ventures and Engagement at Harvard Radcliffe Institute. It is my distinct honor to welcome you to this exciting lecture and discussion in the Institute's Science Lecture Series, with our current emphasis on food sustainability and climate change. Earlier this academic year, in October of 2023, we held our annual science symposium titled Feeding the Future: Food Sustainability and Climate Change. That symposium explored the dilemma, or seeming dilemma, of addressing the global climate crisis while feeding the world's population healthfully and equitably. After all, how we produce, transport, prepare, and consume food has direct implications for the future of the entire planet, as at least a quarter of greenhouse gas emissions stem from the food sector. I note in passing that a full recording of the symposium is available on the Radcliffe website. Now, that major symposium was a key component of our institute-wide and multidisciplinary climate change initiative, our omnibus effort to investigate the causes and consequences of the climate crisis, to develop strategies in adaptation and mitigation, and to address issues of climate justice in thought and action, analytically, normatively, aesthetically, and socio-politically. We particularly seek to address the effects of the climate crisis on marginalized and vulnerable communities, both locally and globally. At the heart of this work is Radcliffe's commitment to supporting and sharing research that promotes innovative solutions and greater equity. This reflects Radcliffe's bedrock commitment to interdisciplinary study, informed by an equally deep dedication to inclusion. We firmly believe that these approaches will generate valuable new insights into effective and equitable and emancipatory ways of addressing climate change. Today's science lecture, titled Using Evidence and Data to Illuminate Our Food Systems, to be delivered by our featured speaker, Professor Jessica Fanzo, brings into focus the Institute's emphasis on addressing climate change from the perspective of concrete action, whether in governmental policy, industry policy, or the everyday lives of private citizens. At a time when facts and data are often openly regarded as suspect by political leaders and business interests, the rigors of evidence-based research may help to bring about wholesale changes in attitudes, political discourse, and social action. Innovations in data gathering and analysis will play a vital role in charting a positive and sustainable direction for food system transformation. To help guide us and the levers of power and decision-making, we will learn from Jessica Fanzo, Professor of Climate and Director of the Food for Humanity Initiative at Columbia University. Our speaker, Professor Fanzo, will be joined in discussion by our moderator, Professor Immaculata De Vivo, Faculty Co-Director of the Science Program at Harvard Radcliffe Institute, Professor of Medicine at Harvard Medical School, and Professor of Epidemiology at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. On behalf of Professor Fanzo and Professor De Vivo, I encourage those here to use the Q&A feature on Zoom to submit your questions at any time during the program. But please keep your questions concise so that we can explore as many questions and topics as possible. Now, it is my distinct pleasure to give the virtual floor to Professor Jessica Fanzo.
Great. Thank you so much, Don, for the invitation. And it's a real pleasure to be able to present to all of you and engage in a discussion with Immaculata. So I'll share my screen and I'll present for about 25 minutes and then we'll have a thoughtful discussion and hopefully get to answer some of your interesting questions. So we'll talk about today, how do we use evidence and data to prioritize and illuminate global food systems as they currently stand in the world today? So I'm going to present this very complex diagram, but just to get us all on the same page. What are food systems? Well, they're complex and they're dynamic. They're made up of many activities and many actors. What this diagram shows is in the gray box, you can see the different components of food systems. Food systems are made up of food supply chains. Foods are produced on landscapes, harvested or raised on in different areas around the world. They are stored, they're processed, they're packaged, distributed, and then hit markets where their foods are sold. You are part of the food system as an individual. You bring with you your economic status, your purchasing power, what you're willing to pay, your information and knowledge that you have, your aspirations and values and preferences. You bring that to the food system when you're making choices about what to order and buy. In the middle here are food environments. This is the place where you do make those decisions. It could be a supermarket. It can be a corner store. It can be a vending machine. These food environments shape your decisions about what you're going to order or purchase, what kind of food is available, what's the affordability of those foods, what are the product properties, their safety, their quality, are they organic, the vendor properties, the location, what's the type of retail, and then the promotion and advertising of those foods. And when you look to the right of this diagram, these supply chains, food environments, and you as an individual, it shapes your behaviors, what kind of foods you acquire, how you prepare those foods, and your practices, and that influences your diets. These diets then shape what we call the outcomes of food systems, and you can see 4 to the right of your diagram. We have environmental outcomes, nutrition and health outcomes, economic and livelihood outcomes, and social equity and justice outcomes. When you look at these broad categories, we're asking our food systems to do a lot. We want them to achieve many goals. Now, over on the left are these drivers, exogenous to the food system, but highly influencing their behavior: urbanization, population pressure, politics, migration, climate change. So we're expecting a lot from food systems, but they're ever changing and quite dynamic. And there's many actors that engage, and everyone every day engages with the food system. So what's happening with food systems? How are they faring? Well, we are motivated to undertake food systems research, really in the context of a changing climate. But we also know that food systems are fragile for various reasons, which I'll talk about. So just to look back on history, food systems have really come to the fore of international development. This notion of what food systems are and their political relevance for human and planetary health has become prioritized in many different policy fora, as well as the Sustainable Development Goals and the climate change agenda. And we've really seen this proliferation of reports, guidelines, policies towards this idea that food systems are important for human and planetary health. But in the context of that, climate change barrels on. We're seeing massive consequences of climate change with rising greenhouse gas emissions, with massive deforestation. Last year was the hottest summer on record, the hottest year on record. There's thought that while that was the hottest summer, it will have been the coldest summer we will have experienced. So we're seeing massive changes to the climate, and a lot of that has to do with the way we humans are living our lives, whether it's our air travel, our water use, our transportation, our energy consumption. We are making a big impact on climate variability and change. And we know that climate change is and will continue to have an impact on food systems. And we can see this in crop yields. This is some work done here at Columbia and NASA, Jonas Jägermeyer, who's shown that using climate models, if we take a business as usual approach to addressing climate change, which is little action, we'll see declines in some crops, particularly in the lower latitudes like maize and soybean and rice. And we'll see in some places in the higher latitudes, bumper crops like for wheat. But when you look particularly in the places, the countries in the Southern Hemisphere that are highly dependent on agriculture for their economic growth, you see declines in crop yields with a warmer world, and this is worrisome. We also have, there's a lot of data to suggest that with more CO2 in the atmosphere, a greenhouse gas, certain crops, depending on the crop and where it's grown, we could see the nutritional quality of those crops decline. So this is two maps showing you the declines in iron and zinc across some major crop commodities and showing you the impacts of the populations that could be significantly affected. Now, iron and zinc are very important micronutrients for growth, cognitive development, etc. So very important for human health, already in sub-deficiencies in many places around the world. So the CO2 fertilization effect of having more CO2 in the atmosphere could change the nutritional composition of crops, putting some micronutrients at risk. We're also not just thinking about long-term climate change, but we're looking at nowcasting, what's happening in the now, the climate variability. And we see that with extreme weather events. This past year, we've seen an escalation and an acceleration and a more dramatic effect of extreme weather events. These pictures are showing you the Vermont floods, the wildfires in Greece, the heat in the southwestern part of the US, floods in India and Pakistan, droughts in the Horn of Africa. Are we prepared for these massive extreme events that continue to shock the planet and shock food systems? At the same time, food systems are victims, but they're also a problem for climate. They're contributors to climate change and environmental degradation. When we look at total greenhouse gas emissions around the world, food systems contribute about 30% of greenhouse gases. This comes from agriculture production, methane produced from cattle digestion, methane from rice paddy systems, emissions from manure and pasture management, land use changes like deforestation, largely driven by cattle production, etc. And food systems are contributing a significant amount. It's not just the energy sector and building and transportation. If food systems are driving 30% of total greenhouse gas emissions, there's a call for action to do something about food systems. Agriculture also uses about 70% of fresh water resources, contributes to biodiversity loss in both animal and plant species, and there's significant implications in our fresh water and ocean fish stocks around the world. So food systems are also contributing to the problem. Now, what this results in is poor diets, poor quality diets, poor access to quality diets. And this is work from the Global Burden of Disease a few years ago, showing that dietary risks, unhealthy diets, are contributing to morbidity and mortality in a significant way. So you can see this graph here of the major causes of death by risk factors, and dietary risk is the second most significant risk factor to mortality in the world. But if you look at the top 5, high blood pressure, high fasting plasma glucose, high body mass index, along with dietary risks, all of these are related to diet. So diets which are meant to nourish us are now killing us, which is ironic. And at the same time, while we want people to be able to access and afford a healthy diet, many cannot. This is a map showing you the percentage of the population around the world who cannot afford a basic healthy diet, one that meets nutrient needs and is health protective. You can see sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, where 75% of the or more of the population can't afford what is considered a healthy diet. In total, almost half of the world, 3 billion people, it's an incredible statistic, cannot afford a healthy diet. And what this results in is multiple burdens of malnutrition. Every country is dealing with at least one form of malnutrition, and many of the statistics for malnutrition are worsening. We still have 735 million people who go to bed hungry. We have almost 150 million children under the age of 5 who are chronically undernourished, or what is called stunted. 45 million children are acutely malnourished, wasting. This 45 million has not really changed as long as I've been a nutritionist, which is a long time. 37 million children under the age of 5 are overweight, unheard of 30 years ago. And 2.2 billion people are overweight and obese. And when you look at this map here on the right, this shows you the countries dealing with massive food insecurity. Never before has this map been so lit up, keeping organizations like the World Food Program, who deliver food assistance, very busy, overly busy, on their knees, trying to get aid to those in dire need. So the scale of malnutrition is just massive. And it begs the question, if we don't do anything about climate, will this get worse? Well, there's a lot we can do across food systems, but we have to take on many actions, multi-level food system priorities. Now, this graph is showing you if we want a 67% chance of staying below 1.5 degrees Celsius in accordance with the Paris climate change targets, we need to take action across a range of food system policies. So that on the left are, we need to change our agriculture production practices, more efficiency, increasing yields, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. But it doesn't quite get us to that 1.5 degree threshold. We need to change our diets, a more plant-dominant diet, eating a healthy amount of calories, not over-consuming. Again, it helps, but doesn't get us to that 1.5. We need to cut food loss and waste in half. But when we do all of these things together and we take action across multiple fronts, we start to come close to reaching the Paris Climate Agreement. But if we take no action on food systems and only action in the energy sector, we won't meet the Paris Agreement. We have to take action on food. So when we think about this macro level data that I showed you and the current scale of food system challenges, governments are taking notice. They're prioritizing food systems, but they don't really know where to act. They often don't know how to navigate such a complex system. And it's hard for them to understand the trade-offs if they take one decision and not another, and which levers to invest in. So we need to provide data and evidence and better use of that data if we want evidence-based decision-making. And as Don said at the beginning, while global governance and prioritization matter, there's a real need for local context, local governance, local solutions, and investments if we want communities who are suffering the brunt of climate change to reap the benefits and adapt. So how can we use data to shed light on food systems? So I'm going to present to you 2 projects that we have going on, which is improving national food system decision-making. So food system transformation, it's urgent. It requires science-based monitoring to help guide public and private decisions and support those who hold decision makers to account, civil society. As I said earlier, policymakers are often navigating in the dark on how their food systems are performing, what are the potential risks, both near and long term, and where to intervene. So what we're trying to do is develop global guidance, better data tools, better metrics, and better models to unpack some of these complex food system science issues. So the first project we have is the Food Systems Dashboard. This is a dashboard that you can go to. It views food systems at the national and global level and brings data together from multiple sources. What we do is we try to simplify as much as possible. So if you're not a data analyst or you're not comfortable playing and trying to understand and unravel complex data, what we do is we try to make it easier to navigate what's happening, what's the state of food systems. So we have mapping tools, we have country profiles, we have some policy actions you could take. And it doesn't require really knowing anything about data. You can easily go to the dashboard and look at maps. You can look at tables across a curated set of indicators that are very visually appealing. We also have set about what's called a diagnostic. So when you go to the dashboard, you can look at what's the state of food systems. But you might want to ask, okay, well, how are food systems actually performing? Are they doing well? Are they not doing so well? And so what we've done is we've taken about 40 indicators and we've set thresholds to them where they could be likely challenge areas or unlikely challenge areas in a traffic light type way. And here you can see a set of low-income countries and a set of high-income countries. Green is an unlikely challenge area. Red is a likely challenge area. And what you can see is that, for example, in high-income countries, you see a lot of red in this last column on environmental outcomes. High-income countries are challenged. They are higher greenhouse gas emitters. They're producing a lot of environmental degradation across their food systems. So they have a lot more work to do. Whereas maybe you see in the nutrition outcomes, this third set, you see that there's a lot of red in low-income countries, struggling with undernutrition, struggling with diet quality. What you see in high-income countries, some green, but a lot of gray, not collected, not prioritized. So this diagnostic tool allows for you to see where countries are sitting and where they could improve, where they're struggling, and where there are data gaps. Another project we have is the Food Systems Countdown Initiative. It's a collaborative effort to monitor food system change and performance over the next decade. We hope that this monitoring framework aligns decision makers around key priorities, incentivizes action, and holds stakeholders that are working on food systems to account. This initiative is made up of about 65 scientists who work on food system metrics, representing every region of the world, and 32 organizations. And we've just published a report, The State of Food Systems Worldwide, that you can download, as well as a Nature Food paper. And what it is we've organized these 65 collaborators into 5 groups. And through a pretty significant 2-year process, they came up with a set of indicators that the world could track over the next decade. We divided this group into 5 working groups: diets, nutrition, and health, environment, natural resources, and production, livelihoods, poverty, and equity, and 2 cross-cutting themes of governance and resilience. These groups got together, they vetted thousands of indicators, and we came up with the 50 indicators that the world could track holistically food systems performance. And you can see these indicators here across the 5 working groups. And what this is showing is low-income countries are in light blue and high-income countries are in dark blue, with the global average in the middle of where these indicators sit, with more desirable trend on the right, more on the left. And you can look at this in the report, but let me just blow up one group. This is the diets, nutrition, and health group. Sorry if you hear that siren. I'm in New York City, which is frequently a normal sound for us living here. But what you see is it's not always bad for low-income countries' performance and good for high-income countries. For example, the cost of a healthy diet, you can see high-income countries are moving towards a less desirable trend, or soft drink consumption of high-income countries, much less desirable. Whereas low-income countries you see are struggling with, for example, the prevalence of undernourishment. So it's not always that high-income countries are doing well and low-income countries are struggling. It's really nuanced when you start to look at some of these indicators. In the report, you can also see regional patterns. And again, I'll blow up one example here. Again, the diets, nutrition, and health group. And you can see regionally how food systems are performing. Ultra-processed food sales, very high in Oceania, North America. The consumption of all 5 healthy food groups, Sub-Saharan Africa and Southern Asia, are struggling more. So it really depends when you start to look at each indicator across a wealth of food system indicators, how countries are performing. So what we learned from the Countdown initiative is that no single region of the world has a monopoly on food system success or on food system challenges. Every region has significant room for improvement, and countries can learn from each other, particularly when they're in the same region. We know that without monitoring a system that shows strengths and weaknesses, countries' attempts to transform their food system, they'll lose their bearings. It's important to monitor what's happening across food systems to make progress on them. We discovered a lot of data gaps that makes it difficult for effective monitoring of food system transformation. So we need more effort and investment in data. And last, we as researchers need to ensure that the data that we produce and the indicators that we track are useful and interpretable for policymakers. We need to sit at the policymakers' table when thinking about how to design research, not the table that we've set. So many of us in research, we just keep our heads down. We do our research. We think it's important. We publish in peer-reviewed journals. And I really like this quote by Murakami: maybe working on the little things as dutifully and honestly as we can is how we stay sane when the world is falling apart. I think many of us researchers feel that way, that if we just work on our thing, we do it dutifully, we'll keep our sanity in times of strife. But now more than ever, we as researchers need to be global citizens, global data citizens. And Don read this out a bit in his intro. And this was a paper, a research vision of food systems in the 2020s, written by the editors of the Global Food Security Journal when I was editor-in-chief. And we felt that during this time, this was in 2019, I think, we really felt the facts and evidence under great scrutiny. Research, science was under great scrutiny, openly disregarded in some situations. But research is really important, and it really can make a difference in the world. It can shape policy, and it can shape decisions. And I hope those of you who do research know that research can and does bring changes. Sometimes you might not see it so directly, but it can change political thought, action, particularly when you put data and evidence in the hands of decision makers and data advocates. So my last slide, the challenges and opportunities for food system research that lay ahead are significant. We still have a lot of work to do to gather evidence. And that requires high quality science to be translated into policy faster than ever before. We can't wait a decade, 2 decades to allow for our results to hopefully translate. We need to push data out there. I think we know the world is witnessing profound and widening gaps to address sustainability and equity, particularly in food systems. These gaps will make future food security very difficult and continuity of life on the planet difficult. As researchers, we have to provide evidence on how to fill those gaps to ensure we meet the demands of a growing population and sustainability and coexisting in amity with the planet. And I think we also need to find those small stitched pockets of progress and glimmers of hope as the basis of our knowledge to move forward dutifully and honestly in these trying times. So I really look forward to the discussion, and thank you so much for tuning in. Immaculata.
Yes, thank you, Jessica. Thank you very much. That was a terrific wide-ranging presentation, and I do have lots of questions, but I'm not going to take over because we have a lot of interesting questions coming in from the audience. There's a lot of enthusiasm, as it should be given your talk. So the statistics were quite alarming. Some of the statistics that you showed about the undernourishment, the overnourishment, but with action, right? You said that we can get to the Paris cutoffs, and so with that, we as researchers, data and research is critical. We know that, and we know we have some really great public health achievements, knowing with data and research that we've done. It comes slow, but it does happen. And the big one is smoking, but it doesn't always, right? It doesn't always elicit action, right? So how do we translate all this rich data and all this research into action so that we can, as researchers, better influence change and action?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I mean, I think many of us in research are very comfortable collecting data, analyzing data, and publishing it in peer review articles. Like, for example, with the countdown, we could have just published our paper in Nature Food and hoped that people would read that, right? But we also, at the same time, put out a public-facing layperson policy report, short, 10 pages, because no one wants to read 200-page reports anymore. So we put out a short report, and that elicits a different audience. A colleague of mine and one of my colleagues, co-chairs of the Countdown, Lawrence Haddad, who leads the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, he used to be co-chair for the Global Nutrition Report, and I then took over with someone else named Corinna Hawks, who's at FAO. And I remember Lawrence saying to me, what do you get, like 200 people maybe citing and reading your peer review papers? It's like, if you work on the Global Nutrition Report, you could have 500,000 people downloading that report. So there's really different audiences. So I think one of the things is, when you have something to say and when you have something that's gone through peer review, think about the multiple platforms you can disseminate that information. I think the other thing as part of the countdown that we did was, one of our core partners is the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO. FAO, like WHO, is very much at the interface with their member states, with countries, with national governments. They provide normative guidance to those governments. They are so key to global policy making. So thinking about also who you partner with, whether it's civil society organizations that can advocate and push hard against governments or for governments and bringing data to light, working with UN agencies who sit at that policy table, thinking about other dissemination, webinars, other things to get your messages out is really, really important. We can't just expect that policymakers are going to pick up Nature and read it from front to back because they won't. We have to figure out the creative ways to engage policymakers and those who are taking on decisions and being active in the space. And I think many of us who work in research, we're not comfortable with data activism. It's hard to brag, or it's hard to pontificate your findings, but it's really important that we all start having a public facing side of us that promotes the kind of research that we're generating.
And maybe that's key, where exactly we're not trained to do the interfacing. Exactly. We write the papers, and, you know, of course so maybe that's part of it, you know, to train us to be this public facing and get the information out in different ways, right? Because you're absolutely right. Unfortunately, there's fewer people are reading huge reports, and so there's got to be a better way to hit that sweet spot. So
and even learning how to speak to media, right? Talking to media is a very skilled craft. And taking media training and getting, every time you think there's an important paper you've done, get your university or your public research institution to put out a press release, because media can take it up. And a lot of people read newspapers or listen to the news, and that could be also another avenue to really get your messages out.
Again, we have to get trained to do that, because we're not, you know, graduate school doesn't it's not amenable to that. You know, you're almost deterred from being too hyperbolic. You know, you almost like apologetic in your conclusions and in your papers. You know, so there is a shift that has to happen. But I want to just try to get through there are a lot of questions in the Q&A, but I just had a few things I'd like to ask. What do you see as areas we as individuals make the biggest change to improve the climate impact when it comes to food?
Yeah, I think there's several ways. You know, I think the evidence is quite clear now that a plant-dominant diet is important for reducing greenhouse gas emissions and some environmental degradation metrics, water use, deforestation. Does that mean you have to completely eliminate meat from your diet? No. And there's a great study showing that a 10% reduction in beef has I think a 30% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions per capita and some health benefits. It was a US study. So reducing, not completely eliminating, is a great first step. Reducing food waste at the household level, really important. Using your freezer, making soups from leftovers, you know, not over shopping. There's a lot of ways on the climate side, but also supporting local farmers is important. Local food's not necessarily a huge impact on climate change, but really important for livelihoods, social cohesion, justice issues, understanding where your food comes from if you buy local, supporting local economies. But really the two big ones from a consumption and food handling perspective is a more plant-dominant diet and reducing your food waste would probably be the big ones.
And that would also hit on the other aspects of your talk about health, right? Diabetes, hypertension. I mean, it's just all in it. It's a win-win, you know, and I think that's part of the messaging. It's sort of like, it's not just climate, it's health, it's the environment, it's meaning the environment writ large, you know, your community. So one more before we get to the Q&A, because there are a few. Where do you see some future challenges that could stall or even disrupt the positive food systems transformation?
What would disrupt transformation? Oh.
What do you see as the expert, some future challenges that could stall?
I think conflict's a big one. You know, whether it's civil wars or country conflicts. We saw when two major bread baskets, Ukraine and Russia, go to war, how that upended the global food system and the market speculation around that, and food prices and food inflation went up. Yeah, another pandemic could stymie transformation. Climate change will continue if there's no action taken, and the extreme events that keep shocking the food system, right? We call them the 3 C's: COVID, climate, and conflict. We in the US have a big issue, a big thing coming up called the election. Politics could very much shape the future climate change agenda, and how that will fare out in multilateral cooperation around that. Climate change, like food systems, because food systems are so interconnected, it's a we are all in this together kind of problem. And if you have one country, the largest, the United States, greenhouse gas emitter per capita, deciding to not participate in global climate action is highly problematic, not only for the US, but for everybody. So politics matter, who we vote for. And this year, 4 billion people are going to be voting for a new president or prime minister. So to me, one of the biggest threats to transformation, when we think about climate and food, is democracy and what that's going to look like at the end of 2024.
Yeah, the interdependence. I'm reminded of that saying that all of us have heard, is that when one of us catches a cold, we all catch a cold, right? One of us sneezes, we all catch a cold. And so the interconnection is there's no other way. We're all connected completely. Yeah. I have one last question before we go to the Q&A. So again, as the expert, what data gaps do you see? And how do we fill those gaps?
Oh, so many. I would say broadly, if you look at the dashboard, you see a real lag. We don't have any real-time data, and there's lots of tools out there like crowdsourcing data. We're not able to capture shocks, extreme events, and how they're immediately impacting food access and food security. So we don't have that very rapid, actionable kind of data. If you look at some of the malnutrition indicators that are collected every 4, 5, 10 years. So that's kind of the temporal issue of food data is one large problem. We don't have a lot of disaggregated data. So we have part of the dashboard is we have 6 countries that are doing subnational dashboards: Nigeria, Indonesia, Mozambique, and a few others, Bangladesh, complicated countries with many different types of food systems within those countries. But when you start to get to the subnational level, data gets thin. Disaggregation around rural, peri-urban, urban, gender, disability, who's marginalized. Very hard to start to get at some of that data. For prioritization, it becomes really difficult. And then I would say probably anyone who's working on different disciplines within food systems will say they have a whole range of data gaps. There's tons of dietary data gaps, tons of different environmental data gaps. The last I would say is this kind of seamless issue. If you look at climate science and data, you have groups of people that work on more near-term or seasonal forecasting, decadal, and then you've got those who work on long-term climate change, and they're separate. How do we bring those together? So you've got this seamless climate data from very near-term hours, nowcasting, all the way to like 2070 kind of data. They exist. How do we bring those groups together to really give that now into the future impacts and risks of climate and its impacts on food systems.
Wow, there's a lot. Well, there's a lot to be done.
Yeah.
Not going to do it all today within the next 15 minutes, but we will take more questions from the audience. So if you have any questions, please submit to the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom. And please keep it concise because we want to get to as many questions as possible. And I will start taking some of the questions, and not unusual, some questions have a common theme. So I will try to address many as these common themes as possible so we can get to other questions. So one question is related to micro hydroponic farming. So do you feel that micro hydroponic farming is a solution that is fiscally viable to sustain food systems?
That I don't know on the fiscally. But if it's okay, can I pivot a bit on that question? Because I think there's going to be a lot of different types of systems, farming system, animal systems into the future. I don't think there's one over another. I think it's very local, context dependent. I think this idea that we often get buried in is this kind of silver bullet approach of this one kind of system makes the most sense. But the beauty and nightmare of food systems is they're so context dependent on where you are, who's managing that land, what kind of food is being grown. So it's hard to answer that question because it depends on that. I would ask back what's the context, who's doing that farming. So I think it really depends, but we need a mosaic of approaches to sustainable food systems. There's not a one answer solution like sustainable intensification or organic farming. You know, it's a whole range of systems that need to be brought to the table, totally dependent on context and the situation.
Right. I would assume all the systems have their trade-offs because that's just.
Oh, yeah.
So.
And what's fiscally viable is dependent, you know, where is that happening? It's a great question from Carrie, but yeah, it really depends on where. Yeah.
So here's given the cost of the sustainable practices and how food companies tend to transfer the cost to consumers, the food choice for consumer comes down to cost and affordability. The question is, how can we incentivize food industry? Can an approach similar to carbon credit work for healthy food credit? Sort of like, you know, for electric cars, you know, the EV rebate. So EV rebate for taxpayers for making sustainable food choices. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I see there's a few questions on industry, food and beverage industries, agro industry. I mean, my view, and there's a bit on greenwashing I can see down below. This is kind of the elephant in the room. What about industry? You know, we're in a situation where food is depending on the kind of food, can be produced in a very cheap way or it can be very expensive. I think the private sector is a huge bucket of very small enterprises to multinationals. So I think, again, I hate to say it depends, but it does depend, right? It depends on what food industry we're talking about. I think there needs to be some sticks and carrots. I think we need some regulation when it comes time to agrochemical companies and food industry. I think that regulation is very hard because many of these multinationals are consolidated and incredibly politically powerful, sometimes more powerful than some governments. So I think there needs to be regulation. I think some of that cost needs to fall on industry. But there also needs to be incentives. And I think particularly on the small scale and medium scale enterprises that are involved in food systems, there needs to be incentives in producing healthier, more sustainable foods. There's a whole range of what that looks like, whether you're a industry player in the farming side or the retail side. But it is really, really complex to deal with industry, particularly when some are incredibly powerful. And, a very small portion of their portfolio is benefiting human and planetary health, but the majority of it is quite detrimental. So we need regulation, but we need the sticks and carrots. We need the regulation, but we need the incentives as well. And finding that sweet spot where industry can produce healthy foods from sustainable food systems, but still make a profit, which is what they are there to do. So how can they have that triple win where they're able to do all three? We need more lessons of how that can be achieved at a massive scale across food systems. And we just don't have that triple win examples yet of where industry has been able to achieve all three.
Well,
Not
jumping around a bit, and you can feel free not to answer this question, but what are the top 2 to 3 areas, food companies? Okay, what are the top 2 to 3 food companies should take action in to improve the food system? What are the top 2 to 3 areas food companies should take action in to improve the food system?
Well, I'll be general, but one of the most detrimental, and I think Immaculata, you'll agree with me, I think one of the most detrimental things in our food system is these ultra processed foods, these foods that are very high in sugar, salts, and fats, have tons of ingredients that you can't recognize. The evidence is accumulating that these are really damaging to human health. They're super cheap to make. They're really cheap to ship around the world. They have long shelf lives. If there's a way we can get industry to start minimizing the sales of these foods, they're proliferating. The sales are up and they're moving around the world to the deepest rural areas. That would be the game changer. These ultra processed foods are and they're really tasty and they're convenient. So the demand for them is high because of that. So how do we make healthy, sustainable foods cheap, tasty, and convenient? That's the thing. And that's the one thing, is how do we make that switch? And that's the hardest. It's hard for industry to reformulate foods, to source higher quality ingredients. It's hard to move people away from these. Potato chips taste great. It's not easy. Not easy for anybody, but that's a big one on the human health side, in my opinion, is that shift.
I'm sorry. Here's an interesting question. Again, I'm bouncing around because there's some common themes, but there's some that are somewhat different. Unlike fossil fuel, foods are highly connected with our cultures and identity. Okay, few people eat by the science book. How can we build on these important science findings, but then move real world changes around cultures across countries?
Such a great question. When you travel around the world and you taste traditional cuisines, those traditional cuisines are often some of the healthier cuisines, right? It's the shift to these kind of homogenous, let's call them Western diets that many refer to, where you start to see the same products around the world. But these traditional cuisines are some of the healthiest, and of course, every traditional diet has some unhealthy foods, and that's fine. But I think, to me, the issue is, I call it the disappearing diet syndrome. We're losing those traditional diets. We're losing that culture. So to me, it's more of how do we hang on to those traditions and keep them alive, that tie people together. I used to live in Italy, and Italy is incredible in its regional traditional cuisines. And you go to Bologna and it's completely different than Rome. and they take pride in that. And there's a lot of celebration around those foods. And it's quite unique. And Italy has found a way to stave off a bit of that, Western type diet. There's a lot of pride. And how do we keep that alive around the world? And, other Georgian diets, very traditionally rich with the wine, their, ancient wine making. These are the kind of traditions that we want to keep, but it's becoming challenging with a globalized world. Yeah, so there's a great book by Dan Saladino called Eating to Extinction that talks a lot about these traditional diets and how do we ensure that they don't disappear. And there's a big project right now, maybe some of you read it in the New York Times today, led by Carrie Fowler at the State Department, trying to bring back the traditional or opportunity crops of Africa, which have moved more towards these colonial crops of maize and rice. But how do we bring back the millets and the sorghums and all these, the fonios and all these traditional crops of Africa? And there's a big research effort to show that these crops are nutritionally relevant, climate resilient. And so again, this is where research becomes really important in shedding light on some of these traditional crops that have lost their way, so to speak.
I have one last question, and I would be remiss if I didn't touch upon the aquaculture. So what role do you see for aquaculture in providing healthy food to substitute for environmentally harmful terrestrial meat?
Huge. Yeah. Aquaculture, huge. I mean, we're depleting our marine and wild fish stocks. Fish is the most traded food commodity in the world. There's a huge demand for fish in multiple forms, whether it's ends up being a sauce or a condiment, or a major part of your plate. Aquaculture will be critically important. We published a paper led by Roz Naylor at Stanford, looking at some of the environmental nutrition constraints of aquaculture and what can be done to improve aquaculture in a more sustainable way. And there's definitely lessons to be learned around the world of unsustainable practices, but also sustainable practices. So I think there's a lot of promise in that field in ensuring that fish stay as a main course in the global diet.
Yes, and I have to say that a lot of the audience, thank you very much. There's a lot of praise for you. And I'd now like to turn it over to my colleague and friend, Dawn, to take us to the end. Thank you, Jess. It was great. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
This concludes our program this evening. I want to thank Professor Jessica Fanzo and Professor Immaculata De Vivo for sharing their innovative work and incisive thoughts, and our great audience for their provocative and probing questions. Also, let me acknowledge the Radcliffe Institute Leadership Society and our annual donors tuned in this afternoon. Let me also specifically acknowledge the Mary E. and Clara Z. Costanza Fund for Science, which is supporting this event. Your generosity keeps Radcliffe programming free and open to the public. We thank you. Today's program has been recorded and will be posted on the Radcliffe website, www.radcliffe.harvard.edu. You can also go to our website for information on future Radcliffe programs and to see videos of past events. Thank you again for joining us this evening, and take care.